Sarah Martinez stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her downtown apartment, watching the city wake up below. 6 months had passed since she first met Alexander Stone, the mysterious billionaire who had somehow managed to break through all her carefully built walls. What started as pure skepticism about his intentions had slowly transformed into something she never expected to feel again: genuine love. The morning sun cast long shadows across her living room as she thought about how dramatically her life had changed. Sarah had always been independent, working her way up from a small-town waitress to a successful marketing consultant in the big city. She prided herself on being able to spot fake people from miles away, especially wealthy men who thought money could buy anything, including her affection. When Alexander first approached her at that charity gala 9 months ago, every alarm bell in her head had gone off. He was too smooth, too perfect, too rich. Men like him didn't genuinely fall for women like her. Middle-class, outspoken, and completely unimpressed by fancy cars and expensive restaurants. She had seen too many friends get their hearts broken by men who collected women like trophies. But Alexander had been different from the start, even when she refused to admit it to herself. He didn't shower her with expensive gifts or try to impress her with his wealth. Instead, he listened when she talked about her work with underprivileged children. He remembered small details about her life that even her closest friends sometimes forgot. When she mentioned loving old bookstores, he took her to a tiny, cramped shop in the oldest part of town instead of some fancy literary event. The real turning point came when Sarah's younger brother, Miguel, got arrested for a crime he didn't commit. She was desperate, scared, and completely out of her depth trying to navigate the legal system. Alexander didn't just offer to pay for lawyers. He rolled up his sleeves and helped her research the case, spending hours making phone calls and using his connections to find witnesses who could prove Miguel's innocence. During those terrifying weeks, Sarah saw a side of Alexander that the business magazines never wrote about. He was patient when she snapped at him from stress. He brought her coffee and sandwiches when she forgot to eat while worrying about her brother. Most importantly, he never made her feel like she owed him anything for his help. The night Miguel was finally cleared of all charges, Sarah found herself crying in Alexander's arms in the courthouse parking lot. Not just tears of relief, but tears of realization. She had fallen in love with this man despite every logical reason her brain had given her not to. He had proven that his feelings for her were real through his actions, not his words. Now, months later, their relationship had settled into something beautiful and unexpected. Alexander respected her independence and never tried to change her lifestyle drastically. He still lived in his penthouse apartment while she kept her modest place, though they spent most nights together. He supported her career goals and even helped her land several major clients through his network, always making sure she knew it was her talent that impressed them, not his influence. Sarah's friends had slowly come around to accepting Alexander, especially after seeing how happy and confident Sarah had become. Her best friend Lisa, who had been the most skeptical of all, now admitted that she had never seen Sarah glow the way she did when Alexander was around. Even Sarah's protective older sister Carmen, who had grilled Alexander like a detective during their first meeting, now called him family. But despite all the positive changes, Sarah still found herself wrestling with moments of doubt. Growing up with financial struggles had taught her to be cautious about anything that seemed too good to be true. Sometimes, late at night, she would lie awake wondering if this happiness could last. Alexander's world was so different from hers. Board meetings, international business trips, charity galas where people spent more on a single dinner than she used to make in a month. The differences became especially apparent when they attended social events together. While Alexander moved effortlessly through crowds of politicians, celebrities, and business leaders, Sarah often felt like an outsider, looking in. These people spoke in code about investments, mergers, and exclusive vacations to places she had only seen in magazines. Though Alexander always made sure she felt included and valued her opinions, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing in a league far above her own. Her insecurities weren't helped by the occasional snide comment from Alexander's social circle. Most people were polite to her face, but Sarah had overheard enough whispered conversations to know that some people saw her as a gold digger or a temporary phase in Alexander's life. These moments stung more than she cared to admit, even though Alexander immediately shut down anyone who spoke disrespectfully about her. One evening, after a particularly uncomfortable dinner party, where several women had made passive-aggressive comments about her simple dress and quaint job, Sarah had broken down and told Alexander she wasn't sure she belonged in his world. Instead of dismissing her concerns or trying to convince her with grand gestures, he had simply held her hand and told her that she made his world better, not the other way around. That conversation had strengthened their bond even more, but it also made Sarah realize that their love story was far from over. They were still learning how to navigate the complexities of their different backgrounds while building something real together. Every day brought new challenges and new reasons to fall deeper in love with each other. As Sarah continued watching the city come alive below, she smiled, thinking about Alexander, who was probably already in his office despite the early hour. Tonight they had plans to cook dinner together at his place, something that had become their favorite way to spend quiet evenings. It was in those simple moments, chopping vegetables and sharing stories about their days, that Sarah felt most certain about their future together. The skeptic in her had been replaced by a woman who was learning to trust in love again, even when it came in the most unexpected package. Alexander Stone finished reading the quarterly reports as his assistant knocked on his office door. The numbers were excellent, his companies were thriving, but his mind kept drifting to Sarah. 3 weeks had passed since their quiet dinner, conversation about belonging in each other's worlds, and he could sense she was still wrestling with doubts about their relationship's future. The business world had always been Alexander's comfort zone. He understood market trends, negotiations, and strategic planning better than most people understood their own hobbies. But love was different. Love required a vulnerability that no MBA program had ever taught him how to navigate. With Sarah, he was constantly learning new ways to show that his feelings went far deeper than the superficial relationships he had experienced before. His previous relationships had been predictable and safe. Women from his social circle who understood the expectations, the charity events, the business dinners where personal conversation took a backseat to networking. These relationships were more like business partnerships than genuine connections, pleasant, convenient, but ultimately hollow. Sarah had changed everything by refusing to play by those unspoken rules. When Alexander first noticed Sarah at the charity gala 10 months ago, she was standing alone by the silent auction table, clearly uncomfortable in the formal setting. Something about her genuine disinterest in the social games around her had caught his attention immediately. While other women at these events often approached him with calculated charm, Sarah had looked like she would rather be anywhere else in the world. Their first conversation had been refreshingly honest. When he introduced himself and mentioned his company, she had simply nodded politely without the usual impressed reaction he was used to receiving. When he offered to buy her a drink, she had accepted but spent most of their time together asking him thoughtful questions about the charity's actual impact rather than flirting or talking about herself. That night, Alexander had gone home thinking about Sarah's infectious laugh and the way she had called out a prominent businessman for making insensitive comments about poverty. She had done it with such grace and intelligence that even the man himself had ended up apologizing and writing a larger check to the charity. Alexander had never met anyone who could be both diplomatic and uncompromising at the same time. The early months of pursuing Sarah had been both the most challenging and most rewarding experience of Alexander's life. She had turned down his invitations to expensive restaurants, preferring coffee shops where they could actually hear each other talk. She had refused his offers to send a car for her, insisting on meeting him places or taking public transportation. Every grand gesture he was used to making fell flat with Sarah, who seemed almost suspicious of anything that cost too much money. It had taken Alexander weeks to realize that Sarah's resistance wasn't about being difficult or playing hard to get. She genuinely believed that wealthy men like him were incapable of seeing women as equals, rather than possessions to be acquired. Her skepticism came from experience, friends who had been hurt by men who used their wealth to control relationships, and her own observations of how money could corrupt even good intentions. The breakthrough had come when Alexander stopped trying. to impress Sarah with what he could afford, and started sharing who he actually was beneath the business suits and board meetings. He told her about growing up with parents who were so focused on building their empire that they forgot to build a family. He shared his struggles with feeling like people only valued him for his money, and his fear that he might never find someone who could love him for himself. Sarah had listened without judgment, and for the first time in years, Alexander had felt truly seen by another person. That night, she had reached across the table at the small diner where they were eating and taken his hand, telling him that everyone deserved to be loved for who they were, not what they owned. Their relationship had deepened quickly after that conversation, but Alexander knew they still faced significant challenges. The pressure from his social circle was constant. His business associates kept making comments about when he would find a suitable partner, clearly implying that Sarah didn't meet their standards. His mother, though polite to Sarah's face, had made several pointed remarks about the importance of finding someone who could contribute to the family's social standing. These comments infuriated Alexander, but he also understood they affected Sarah more than she let on. He had noticed her becoming quieter at social events, smiling less, freely and second-guessing herself in conversations. The confident, outspoken woman he had fallen in love with was starting to shrink herself to fit into spaces that didn't deserve her presence. Last month, everything had come to a head at a business dinner when one of Alexander's longtime associates had made a particularly cruel comment about Sarah's background within her hearing. Alexander had immediately ended the business relationship, making it clear that anyone who disrespected Sarah was no longer welcome in his life. But the damage had been done. Sarah had been unusually quiet for days afterward, and Alexander could see her rebuilding the walls he had worked so hard to help her tear down. The situation had forced Alexander to confront some difficult truths about his own world. He had spent so many years accepting the shallow values and casual cruelty of his social circle that he had almost forgotten there were better ways to live. Sarah's presence in his life had highlighted just how toxic many of his relationships had become. Now Alexander found himself at a crossroads. He could continue trying to help Sarah fit into his existing world, watching her slowly lose pieces of herself in the process. Or he could make some dramatic changes to create a life that honored both of their values and backgrounds. The choice seemed obvious, but the practical implications were overwhelming. Changing his entire social and professional network would mean losing some business relationships and disappointing family members who had specific expectations for his life. But keeping things the same would mean potentially losing Sarah, and that was a price Alexander knew he could never pay. As he prepared to leave the office for their dinner date, Alexander made a decision that would reshape both of their futures. It was time to stop asking Sarah to adapt to his world and start building a new world that they could both call home. The small Italian restaurant Sarah had chosen was nothing like the places Alexander usually took business clients. Red checkered tablecloths, wine bottles used as candle holders, and the owner's family photos covering every inch of the walls. But watching Sarah's face light up as she translated the handwritten menu for him, Alexander couldn't remember ever feeling more content in any five-star establishment. They had been coming to Luigi's for 2 months now, ever since Sarah had mentioned missing the authentic Italian food from her childhood neighborhood. The elderly owner, Mrs. Romano, had immediately adopted them both, insisting on bringing them extra bread and sharing stories about her late husband's recipes. Tonight she had outdone herself preparing a special dish that wasn't even on the menu. "She reminds me of my grandmother," Sarah said, watching Mrs. Romano argue with her son about the proper way to prepare the sauce. "Nonna used to cook like this. Everything made with love and no measuring cups in sight." Alexander smiled, but Sarah could tell something was on his mind. He had been unusually quiet during their meal, picking at his food and checking his phone more than usual. She had learned to read his moods over the past year, and tonight he seemed to be wrestling with some kind of important decision. "What's going on?" she asked directly, reaching across the table to still his restless fingers. "You've been somewhere else all evening." Alexander looked into her eyes and felt the familiar flutter of amazement that this incredible woman had chosen to love him. Even now, after all these months together, He sometimes couldn't believe she was real. Tonight her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail and she wore a blue sweater that brought out her eyes. She looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked like home. "I've been thinking about what you said last month," he began carefully, "about not belonging in my world. And I realize you were right, but not in the way you meant." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had been dreading this conversation, the one where Alexander finally admitted that their differences were too great to overcome. She had seen it coming in the way his friends looked at her, heard it in his mother's carefully polite voice, felt it in the growing distance between his world and hers. "Alexander, if this is about—" "Let me finish," he interrupted gently. "You don't belong in my world because my world isn't good enough for you. It's full of people who judge others based on bank accounts and zip codes. People who think kindness is weakness and compassion is naive. You shouldn't have to shrink yourself to fit into that." Sarah stared at him, not sure where this conversation was heading. "So, what are you saying?" Alexander took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything between them. "I'm saying that I want to build a new world with you, one where we don't have to choose between your values and my responsibilities, where we can be successful without being cruel, wealthy without being wasteful, and powerful without being predatory." He pulled out his phone and showed her several real estate listings he had bookmarked. "I've been looking at houses outside the city, places where we could have space for the family you want, the garden you've talked about, the art studio you've always dreamed of having." Sarah's eyes widened as she scrolled through the photos. These weren't the mansions she had expected, but beautiful, normal homes with character and warmth. Houses that looked like places where people actually lived instead of just entertained business associates. "I've also been restructuring my companies," Alexander continued. "Moving away from partnerships with people who don't share our values, investing more in businesses that make a positive difference. It means less profit in the short term, but I've realized that making money off other people's suffering isn't the kind of legacy I want to leave." Sarah felt tears starting to form, but she wasn't sure if they were from happiness or fear. "Alexander, you can't change your entire life for me. What about your family's expectations? Your business relationships? Everything you've built? I'm not changing my life for you," he said firmly. "I'm changing it for us. For the future we want to build together. My family will adjust because they love me. And if they don't, then maybe they weren't the family I thought they were. The business relationships I lose weren't worth keeping if they required me to compromise my integrity." Mrs. Romano appeared, at their table with dessert they hadn't ordered, taking one look at Sarah's emotional face and immediately assuming Alexander had proposed. She began chattering excitedly in Italian, calling to her son and daughter-in-law to come see the happy couple. Sarah laughed through her tears, trying to explain in broken Italian that they weren't engaged. But Mrs. Romano was already bringing out a bottle of her best wine to celebrate. "She's getting ahead of herself," Sarah whispered to Alexander as Mrs. Romano continued her celebration. "Maybe not by much," Alexander replied quietly, his eyes holding a promise that made Sarah's heart race. As the evening wound down and they walked slowly back to Sarah's apartment, she found herself thinking about all the ways Alexander had already changed since they met. He was more relaxed now, more genuine in his interactions with others. He had started volunteering at the children's center where Sarah worked, and she had watched him transform from an awkward rich guy trying to help into someone the kids genuinely loved and trusted. "There's something else," Alexander said as they reached Sarah's building. "I want you to meet someone important to me. My mentor, James Sullivan. He's the one who taught me that business could be a force for good instead of just profit. He's been asking to meet you for months." Sarah nodded, though she still felt nervous about meeting more people from Alexander's world, even ones he spoke about with such obvious affection and respect. "He's different from the others," Alexander assured her, reading her expression. "He built his fortune by creating jobs and supporting communities, not by taking advantage of people. I think you'll like him, and I know he'll love you." That night, as Sarah lay in bed thinking about everything Alexander had shared, she realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. For the first time since they met, she felt like they were truly building something together instead of her trying to fit into his existing life, or him trying to abandon his responsibilities for her. The future Alexander had described wasn't just a dream anymore, it was a plan they could actually implement together. And for the first time in her adult life, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love really could conquer the practical obstacles that had always seemed insurmountable before. James Sullivan's office was nothing like what Sarah had expected. Instead of the cold modern spaces she had seen in other wealthy businessmen's buildings, this felt warm and lived in. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with everything from business journals to poetry collections. Family photos sat alongside awards, and a well-worn leather couch faced a window overlooking a community garden that James had helped fund. Sarah had been nervous about this meeting for a week, despite Alexander's constant reassurances. Meeting. His mentor felt like an important test she needed to pass, and she wasn't sure she was ready for another round of subtle judgments about her background or her relationship with Alexander. But from the moment James stood up to greet them, Sarah felt some of her tension ease. He was older than she had expected, probably in his 70s, with kind eyes and a genuine smile that reminded her of her favorite professor in college. When he shook her hand, he looked directly at her face instead of giving her the quick up and down assessment she had grown used to receiving from Alexander's other associates. "Sarah, I've been looking forward to meeting you for months," James said, gesturing for them to sit on the comfortable couch rather than the formal chairs arranged around his desk. "Alexander talks about you constantly, and I have to admit, I was curious about the woman who managed to make this workaholic remember there's life outside the office." Alexander looked slightly embarrassed, but Sarah could see the deep affection between the two men. She had heard stories about James over the past year, how he had taken Alexander under his wing when Alexander was just starting out, teaching him that business success and personal integrity didn't have to be mutually exclusive. "Alexander tells me you work with children," James continued, settling into his chair with a cup of tea. "That must be incredibly rewarding work." For the next hour, Sarah found herself in the kind of conversation she had almost forgotten was possible with someone from Alexander's world. James asked thoughtful questions about her work at the community center, her ideas for expanding programs, and her thoughts on how business leaders could better support educational initiatives in underserved communities. What surprised Sarah most was that James seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, not just being polite. When she mentioned her frustration with funding cuts that had eliminated art programs at several local schools, James pulled out a notebook and started taking notes, asking for specific details about costs and logistics. "You know," James said, after Sarah finished explaining her vision for mobile art classrooms that could serve multiple schools, "I've been looking for meaningful ways to invest in education. This sounds like exactly the kind of program that could make a real difference." Alexander watched the conversation with growing amazement. He had hoped James and Sarah would like each other, but seeing them connect over shared values and genuine passion for helping others was even better than he had imagined. This was what he wanted more of in his life, relationships built on substance rather than social status. As the meeting continued, Sarah began to understand why Alexander spoke about James with such respect. Unlike the other wealthy men she had met through Alexander, James asked about her family, her goals, and her ideas with real curiosity. When she mentioned her brother Miguel's legal troubles from the previous year, James nodded with understanding rather than judgment. "The justice system is particularly harsh on young men from certain communities," James observed. "I'm glad Alexander was able to help, and I'm even more glad that Miguel had a sister willing to fight for him." It was a small comment, but it showed Sarah that James understood the realities she had grown up with in ways that most of Alexander's social circle never would. She found herself relaxing completely for the first time in months, speaking freely about her dreams and concerns without worrying about saying the wrong thing or revealing too much about her background. When James asked about her relationship with Alexander, Sarah was surprised by her own honesty. "I love him more than I ever thought possible," she said simply. "But sometimes I worry that we're too different. Not just the money thing, but the whole world that comes with it. I don't want to change him, but I also can't pretend to be someone I'm not." James nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I worried about the same thing when Alexander first started working with me. He was so eager to fit in with the established business community, that I was afraid he might lose the qualities that made him special in the first place. His compassion, his genuine desire to help people, his ability to see possibilities where others only saw problems. He turned to look at Alexander with paternal pride. But watching him with you has shown me that I didn't need to worry. You've brought out the best parts of who he's always been, while he's given you the resources to expand the impact you were already making in the world. That's what real partnerships look like. As they prepared to leave, James handed Sarah a business card for his foundation. I meant what I said about the mobile art classroom program. Would you be willing to put together a proposal? I think we could make something wonderful happen for those kids. Walking back to the car, Sarah felt lighter than she had in weeks. He's amazing, she told Alexander. I can see why you respect him so much. He likes you, Alexander replied, though that was an understatement. James had pulled him aside while Sarah was looking at the photos on his bookshelf and told him that Sarah was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He also gave me some advice, Alexander continued as they drove through the city. He said that the best relationships aren't about two people trying to become one person, but about two whole people choosing to build something together that neither could create alone. That evening, as they cooked dinner together in Alexander's kitchen, Sarah found herself thinking about James's words. For months, she had been focused on whether she could fit into Alexander's world, or whether he was willing to leave his world behind for her. But maybe the real question was whether they could build a new world together, one that honored both of their backgrounds while creating space for the future they both wanted. Alexander, she said suddenly, putting down the wooden spoon she had been using to stir the pasta sauce. I want to try something new. He looked up from the salad he was preparing, curious about the determined expression on her face. I want to stop worrying about whether I belong in your world or whether you're giving up too much for mine, Sarah continued. I want to focus on building our world together, whatever that looks like. Alexander set down his knife and crossed the kitchen to pull Sarah into his arms. I was hoping you'd say that, he murmured against her hair, because I have some ideas about what our world might look like, and I think you're going to love them. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the middle of what would soon become her art studio, surrounded by boxes and the smell of fresh paint. The house Alexander had found was everything she had dreamed of, but never dared to ask for. Spacious enough for the family they hoped to have someday, but cozy enough to feel like home. Large windows filled every room with natural light, and the backyard was perfect for the garden she had always wanted to plant. The transition from their separate apartments to this shared space had been surprisingly smooth. Alexander had insisted that Sarah choose all the furniture and decorating, wanting the house to feel like hers rather than just another one of his properties. But Sarah had quickly learned that creating a home together meant finding ways to blend both of their tastes and needs. The living room showcased this perfectly. Sarah's colorful artwork hung next to Alexander's collection of first-edition books, and the comfortable sectional sofa they had chosen together was large enough for Alexander's long legs, but arranged to encourage conversation rather than formal entertaining. Every room told the story of two people learning to build a life together. The biggest change, though, was in how they spent their time. Alexander had made good on his promise to restructure his business commitments, turning down several lucrative deals that conflicted with their values. He still worked long hours sometimes, but he was home for dinner most nights, and weekends were reserved for their relationship and the community projects they had begun working on together. Sarah had been amazed by how naturally Alexander had adapted to a simpler lifestyle. The man who used to think nothing of spending thousands of dollars on a single business dinner now got genuinely excited about finding good deals at the farmer's market. He had traded his expensive sports car for a practical SUV that could haul supplies for their volunteer work, and he seemed happier than she had ever seen him. The mobile art classroom project with James's foundation had exceeded everyone's expectations. What started as Sarah's dream of bringing art education to underserved schools had grown into a comprehensive program serving 12 schools across 3 districts. Alexander had used his business connections to secure donations of art supplies and equipment, while Sarah had trained a team of volunteer instructors and developed age-appropriate curricula. Watching Alexander interact with the children in the program had been one of Sarah's greatest joys over the past few months. The first time he had visited one of the mobile classrooms, he had been nervous and awkward, clearly out of his element with the enthusiastic 8-year-olds who couldn't care less about his business accomplishments. But the kids had quickly warmed to his patient explanations and genuine interest in their artwork, and now several of them asked for Mr. Alex specifically when the mobile classroom arrived at their school. The success of the art program had led to other collaborative projects. They were currently working with James's foundation to develop an after-school tutoring program, and Alexander had connected Sarah with several other philanthropists who were interested in funding educational initiatives. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt like she had the resources to make all the changes she had dreamed of but never thought possible. The evening sun was streaming through the studio windows when Alexander arrived home from work, finding Sarah organizing art supplies on the built-in shelves he had surprised her with last month. She was wearing paint-splattered clothes and had managed to get blue paint in her hair somehow, but Alexander thought she had never looked more beautiful. "How was the setup day?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind and kissing the top of her head. "Perfect," Sarah replied, leaning back against his chest. "The new canvases arrived this morning and I finished organizing all the brushes by size. The first group of kids comes next week and I think everything's ready." They had decided to host some of the art classes at their house, creating a more intimate setting where children could work on longer-term projects. The studio was designed to accommodate up to 15 kids at a time, with adjustable tables, excellent lighting, and plenty of storage for ongoing projects. "James called this afternoon," Alexander said, settling into the comfortable chair they had placed by the window so he could keep Sarah company while she worked. "The school board approved our proposal for the permanent art rooms. Construction starts this summer." Sarah turned around with a huge smile. After months of meetings and paperwork, 3 of the schools in their program would be getting dedicated art classrooms, funded by James's foundation, but designed with input from Sarah and the teachers who would use them. "I can't believe this. It's real sometimes," Sarah said, gesturing around the studio and then toward Alexander. "A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be living in a house like this with a man like you, planning projects that could help thousands of kids, I would have laughed." Alexander stood up and crossed the room to take her hands in his. "A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be happier living a simple life with the woman I love than I ever was trying to impress people I didn't even like, I would have thought they were crazy." As they walked through their house together, turning off lights and checking that everything was secure for the night, Sarah reflected on how naturally they had fallen into these domestic routines. Alexander had never lived with anyone before her, and Sarah had been worried that he might feel suffocated by the constant companionship after years of having complete privacy and independence. But instead, Alexander seemed to thrive on their shared daily rituals. He made coffee every morning while Sarah checked her email, and they had developed a habit of debriefing their days during their evening walks around the neighborhood. On weekends, they cooked elaborate meals together, tried new hiking trails, or worked in the garden they were slowly creating in their backyard. The garden had become a special project for both of them. Neither had any real experience with plants, but they were learning together, making mistakes and celebrating small victories like their first successful tomatoes or the surprise bloom of wildflowers Sarah had planted along the fence line. "I have something for you," Alexander said as they reached their bedroom. He had been carrying a small wrapped package, and Sarah had been trying not to ask about it all evening. Sarah opened the gift carefully, revealing a beautiful leather-bound journal with her name embossed in gold on the cover. "For recording all your ideas about new programs and projects," Alexander explained. "And maybe for writing down some of the stories the kids tell you. You have such a gift for capturing people's voices." Sarah hugged the journal to her chest, touched by Alexander's thoughtfulness. He had been encouraging her to write more, believing that her insights about education and community development could help other people working in similar fields. As they settled into bed that night, Sarah found herself thinking about the skeptical woman she had been just over a year ago. That woman had been so focused on protecting herself from disappointment that she had almost missed out on the greatest joy of her life. Learning to trust Alexander had been scary, but it had also taught her that sometimes the most impossible Dreams were just waiting for the right person to believe in them alongside you. Alexander, she whispered in the darkness. I love our life together. His arms tightened around her as he pressed a kiss to her forehead. So do I. More than I ever thought it was possible to love anything. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of their bedroom as Sarah slowly opened her eyes, feeling unusually peaceful for someone who typically woke up with her mind already racing through the day's to-do list. It was Saturday, and for the first time in weeks they had no scheduled commitments, no meetings about foundation projects, no volunteer obligations, just a quiet weekend at home together. Alexander was already awake, propped up against the headboard with his laptop balanced on his knees, probably reviewing reports or answering emails that couldn't wait until Monday. But when he noticed her, stirring, he immediately closed the computer and set it aside. "Good morning, beautiful," he said softly, pulling her closer to him. "I was trying not to wake you. You've been working so hard lately." Sarah snuggled against his chest, enjoying the rare luxury of having nowhere urgent to be. The past month had been incredibly busy with the launch of their new after-school program, and they had both been putting in long hours to make sure everything ran smoothly. The program was already serving over 200 children, and the waiting list kept growing. "What time is it?" she asked, though she didn't really care about the answer. "Just after 8, Alexander replied, running his fingers through her hair. "I was thinking we could make that fancy breakfast you've been wanting to try, the one with the poached eggs and homemade bread." Sarah smiled against his chest. 6 months ago, Alexander wouldn't have known how to make toast without burning it, but he had been taking cooking lessons as a surprise for her. She pretended not to know about the lessons, even though she had found the cookbook he kept hidden in his office and had overheard him on the phone with the instructor several times. As they made their way to the kitchen, Sarah noticed the small changes that had transformed their house into a real home over the past year. Alexander's business magazines now shared space on the coffee table with her art books. The formal dining room had been converted into a workspace where they could both spread out their projects. The refrigerator was covered with drawings from the children in their programs, held up by magnets Alexander had bought from every place they had traveled together. The kitchen had become the heart of their home, just as Sarah had always dreamed it would be. They had spent countless evenings here cooking together while discussing their days, their dreams, and their plans for the future. Alexander had turned out to be a surprisingly good cook once he stopped trying to follow recipes exactly and started trusting his instincts. "I have news," Alexander said as he carefully cracked eggs into the simmering water. "James called last night after you went to sleep. The university wants to offer you an adjunct teaching position in their education department." Sarah nearly dropped the bread she was slicing. "What? How did that even come up?" "Apparently several professors have been following our programs, and they're impressed with your curriculum development and teaching methods. They want you to teach a course on community-based education initiatives." The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah had always loved learning, but she had never imagined herself in an academic setting. Her knowledge came from hands-on experience rather than advanced degrees, and she worried that university students wouldn't take her seriously. "You don't have to decide right now," Alexander said, reading her expression perfectly. "But I think you'd be amazing at it. You have insights that most professors could never teach because they've never actually worked in the communities they study." After breakfast, they decided to take a long walk through their neighborhood, something that had become their favorite weekend tradition. The area was a perfect blend of families and young professionals, with tree-lined streets and small businesses that had become part of their regular routine. The owners of the local coffee shop now knew their names and usual orders. The elderly man who ran the used bookstore always saved interesting titles he thought they might enjoy. As they walked, Sarah found herself thinking about how much their relationship had evolved since those early days, when she had been so afraid of being hurt. The skeptical woman who had once analyzed Alexander's every gesture for signs of deception had been replaced by someone who trusted him completely, not because he was perfect, but because he had proven over and over again that his love for her was genuine and unconditional. Their relationship hadn't been without challenges. They had learned to navigate their different communication styles. Alexander's tendency to solve problems immediately, versus Sarah's need to process her feelings first. They had figured out how to balance Alexander's natural generosity with Sarah's fierce independence. They had worked through Sarah's occasional insecurities about fitting into Alexander's world, and Alexander's fears that his privileged background made him less worthy of Sarah's love. But every obstacle they had overcome had made them stronger as a couple. They had learned to be completely honest with each other, even when the truth was uncomfortable. They had discovered that their different backgrounds weren't weaknesses to overcome, but strengths that complemented each other perfectly. "There's something I've been wanting to talk to you about," Alexander said as they sat down on a bench overlooking the small lake in the center of their neighborhood. His voice had taken on the serious tone he used when discussing important business decisions, and Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. "What's on your mind?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light despite the sudden racing of her heart. Alexander turned to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his. "Sarah, this past year and a half has been the best period of my entire life. You've changed everything about how I see the world, how I want to spend my time, what I think success really means." Sarah's throat tightened as she saw Alexander reach into his jacket pocket. She had wondered if this moment would come, had even hoped for it sometimes, but now that it was happening, she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was asking. "I know we've talked about marriage in general terms," Alexander continued, pulling out a simple but beautiful ring that perfectly matched Sarah's unpretentious style. "But I want to make it official. I want everyone to know that you're the person I choose every day for the rest of my life." The ring was perfect, a single diamond in a classic setting that was elegant without being ostentatious. Sarah could tell that Alexander had put thought into choosing something that reflected her personality, rather than trying to impress her with size or expense. "Sarah Martinez," Alexander said, his voice slightly shaky with emotion. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. She looked at Alexander's hopeful, nervous face and thought about everything they had built together, not just their successful programs and beautiful home, but the deep partnership that had grown between them. They had proven that love really could bridge any gap if both people were willing to work at it. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, absolutely yes." As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah felt the last of her old fears dissolve, completely. The skeptic who had once protected her heart by refusing to believe in fairy tale endings was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had learned that the best love stories weren't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone perfect for you. They sat on that bench for another hour, making plans and dreaming about their future together. They would have a small wedding, probably in their backyard garden. They would continue growing their foundation programs, maybe expand into other cities. They would travel together, start a family, keep learning and growing and building the life they had discovered was possible when two people truly committed to loving each other well. As the sun began to set over the lake, Sarah looked at the ring sparkling on her finger and smiled. From skeptic to soulmate, it had been the most unexpected journey of her life, and she wouldn't change a single moment of it.